Hey everyone, Dom here. In this snippet, we are going to talk about some of the built-in functions of array in JavaScript, specifically map, reduce, and filter. Now, you may use this very often in your code, but do you know how to implement them? Personally, I like to use these questions in interviews because the implementation might be pretty short, but it allows you to quickly judge a candidate's proficiency in JavaScript. Now, let's go dive in and look at how these functions work. So first, let's look at the map function. This one's pretty straightforward. We want to transform every data in the array to something else. In the example below, right here, we see that each element is being multiplied by 2, right? So this is the expected output. Let's go ahead and run it. All right. So then down here, we see the parameters and the expected return value for this function. It's important to note that we are returning a new array and not modifying the existing one. If you scroll down more in this documentation, you can actually see the implementation of map. Now we are going to work on a much simpler implementation later on. Next, we're going to look at the array.filter function. Filter returns a new array where all the elements pass our filter function. The filter function is one that returns true or false. If true, then the element is included in the resulting array, and if false, then it is excluded. Let's look at the example right here. Basically, what they have over here is that it only return the words where there are at least 6 characters. All right, let's run it. So as we can see, this is the expected output, and this is what we get. So scrolling down below, we look at the parameters and the return value. It pretty much looks like what we had for map as well, right? There's also a bunch of examples down here, so I encourage you to look at those later on. I'll be putting the links to all these documentations down in the description. Last on our list is array.reduce. Now this is interesting because this one does not specifically return an array, although it could, but it's always a single output. It goes through each element in the array and combine the elements in some fashion according to your reducer function, and returns a combination of all of them in the end. So let's go over the example they have here. The reducer function they created is one that just sums up all the elements as you pass through them. Accumulator here represents the sum of the elements so far, and the current value is basically the current element in the array that you are processing. They have 2 examples below. One where they are passing in the reducer function, and one where there's an extra parameter, which is 5. This represents the initial value. So if this is given, this is the initial value of accumulator, and if not, it will be the first element in the array. So as you can see, this one is saying that it's just the sum of all the elements. Well, this one is sum of all the elements starting and adding 5 in the beginning. So let's run it, and this is the output, and that's exactly what was expected. So again, same as before, you get all the specifics down here in terms of parameters and return value. As you scroll down more, they have the implementation, but also tons of examples. So now you can use reduce. In fact, going all the way kind of like to the bottom, they even have one on how you can implement map using reduce. I think this will be an interesting bonus question or challenge. So now that we went over these functions, time to write our own. Let's work on our own map function. Put in again the URL here for the documentation for reference. So the map function returns a new array that contains the results of calling func on the elements of the calling array. The parameters passed to func are element and index. Below, I've created 2 test cases for us to work with when we implement this function. The first one adds 1 to all elements in the array. The second one is simply just a collection or creates an array of strings that shows what element is contained at one index. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is implement this function, and unlike before, I'm actually just gonna implement this without fast forwarding because the functions are very short. The first thing we want to do here is create our resulting array. This is the one that we are going to return at the end of our function. This is also where we're going to put in all the results of calling func give it for each element that's in the array. Okay, so to do that, we simply have to make a loop. I'm going to create a for loop that loops over each element. First thing to notice here is my use of the keyword this. This, in this instance, refers to basically the calling array, right? So as you can see, I put in this dot length. That means the length of the original array. Okay, and what we want to do is to just call or to push into our resulting array the result of calling func and passing in the element and the index, right? So in that instance, what we want to do is call func, and this brackets I signifies the element and the current index, and I is the current index. Then we just return result. Oops. All right. As you can see here on the right side, the console actually started printing stuff. So I'm just going to clear this to make things easier. Now let's go over the test cases that we have earlier. I'm going to go refresh this to see what the console is logging. The first one, like we said, adds 1 to all the elements, and we are seeing 2, 3, 4 as the result here. So that's correct. It added 1 to every single element. The second one returns an array of strings. Just expand this a little bit, and we can see that it's basically showing what is at every index in the array. For example, item at index 0 contains 1, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the map function. Again, this is a simple implementation, and the real one has some more complexities in it that you can find here in this URL. Now let's go ahead and create our filter function. Again, as a recap, the filter function returns a new array that contains all the elements that satisfy the filter func. The func needs to return a boolean. If it's true, that element in the array is included, and if it's false, then it's excluded. The parameters passed to the function are element and index, similar to the map function. Let's look at the test cases I have down here. So I have my array, sample array that we will use for the filter function. Then the first test case is to grab all the elements less than 5. Okay, and the next test case basically grab all the elements that are in the even indices of the array, so 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, let's go ahead and start implementing our filter function. Again, this one's pretty short and simple. We are gonna create the same resulting array from before, where we're gonna push in the results. Then we are gonna create a for loop that will loop at every single element in the array. After that, remember, we need to see if the func returns true or false. And if it does, then we push the element into the resulting array. So to do that, all we have to do is include an if condition. And we call in func in our condition, pass in the element, pass in the index. If that returns true, then result.push, we push in the current element. And at the very end, we return result. All right, so that should technically do it. I'm gonna go save this. I'm gonna go clear it over here and refresh. So let's go over our test cases. First test case, again, grab all elements less than 5. What we see on the right side over here is 1, 4, and 3. Those are all less than 5. All right, so that works for our first thing. The second test case, even indices of the array. So what we see here is 7, 5, 4. So again, that's 0, 1 is skipped, 2, third index is skipped, fourth is included, right? So 7, 5, 4. Right. So there we go. That's our filter implementation. Lastly, we are going to create our own array.reduce function. This one is the one that returns a single output after we execute the reducer func on each element of the array. You can optionally provide an initial value to start from. So the parameters passed to the func are accumulator, current element, and index. Accumulator here is the output so far as you iterate over every single element. So for my test cases down here, the first one returns the total number of letters in the array, right? So we have fox, bear, zebra. The point of this first test case is to add up all the characters here and return the total count of characters. Okay. The second test case we have here is something that just creates a sentence, and the initial value passed is that the animals in the zoo are. So basically, I'm expecting one string at the end that says the animals in the zoo are fox, bear, and zebra. All right, let's go ahead and implement the reducer function. So this would be the function that has the most lines so far, because there are different things we have to check for here. First, we have to create the accumulator, or a variable that represents the value so far. Let's call that act and initialize it with a null value. And then we keep track of our index as well. We start at index 0. And the reason I'm keeping track of index here is because there could be an initial value that's passed, or there could be none. And that's why we have to check if that's existing. So if the initial value is null, that means we need to make the first element in our calling array to be the initial value. Okay, so that would make act to be equal to this 0 and index equals 1. That setting index to 1 means that when I start creating my loop, this is going to be the first item that I'm going to look at. Okay, we need to skip index 0 because we have already initialized act to be index 0. If there is an initial value, so oops, all we have to do is set our act to the initial value, and index will remain as 0. Okay, and then like before, we just create our for loop, but instead of starting at 0, we start at index, which could be 0 or 1. And then what do we do here? Well, for this one, we need to make sure to make our accumulator equal to calling the func, right? The reducer function. While we pass in the values, the accumulated value so far, or act, we pass in the current element, and we pass in the index. Okay. And then at the very end, we just return the accumulator, because that is the last output that we want this function to return. Okay, as you can see here on the right side, it already started printing out the console log. So I'm gonna go clear this and refresh. All right, so for test case 1, the total number of letters in the array 12. That's correct. It's 3 plus 4 plus 5. All right, for test 2, like I said, it's gonna create a sentence which just kind of, you know, adds on to the original strings. The animals in the zoo are fox, bear, zebra. So you can see I have a comma here. I, didn't clean that up. Again, one thing to note here is that this is a simple implementation. I actually did not check if the array, the calling array, has at least more than one element. If it has 0 elements in it, this 0 will actually be undefined, and you might have unexpected results. So it's important that if you implement this later on, that you do proper type checking and things to check if the length of the array is at least greater than 1. Okay? All right, and that should be it. So now that we've learned how to implement simple versions of built-in array functions in JavaScript, a good practice would be to look at the other ones and try to implement them from scratch. Or you can even extend the ones we've worked on today, like say an asynchronous map function where the callback returns a promise. Again, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to get notified of new videos, and drop a comment to say hi or if you have any questions. The link to the code sandbox today is down in the description, so don't forget to check that out. Till next time!